The constable's hand went up before the car even stopped rolling. "Pull over. Right here. Don't move." Captain Adisa Okafor-Mensah had been driving the same stretch of Carling Avenue for 11 years. He knew every pothole, every traffic light, every Tim Hortons that stayed open past midnight. He also knew what it meant when a patrol cruiser cut across 2 lanes to block your path at 10:47 on a Tuesday night. Not because you'd done anything wrong, but because you existed in the wrong skin, in the wrong neighborhood, at the wrong hour. He put the car in park, kept both hands on the wheel, breathed. The constable who approached his window was young, couldn't have been more than 26, with the particular energy of someone who had recently been given authority and hadn't yet figured out how to carry it. His name tag read Faucht. His partner stayed by the cruiser, arms crossed watching. "License and registration," Fawcett said. "Not asked," said. Okafor-Mensah reached slowly toward the glove box, announced every movement the way he'd been trained. Not in police training, but in the quieter, more brutal curriculum that black men in Canada learn from fathers and uncles and older brothers. "Slow, announce, don't startle." "Sir," he said, handing over his documents. "May I ask what this stop is about?" Fawcett didn't answer. He looked at the license, looked at the man, looked back at the license. The address said Barhaven. The car was a dark grey Volvo, 7 years old, well maintained. There was nothing here that should have meant anything to anyone. "You're a long way from home," Fawcett said. "I had a meeting at the base," Okafor-Mensah replied. "I'm on my way back, the base. CFB Ottawa." "Yes." Fawcett looked at him the way people look at a word they don't believe is spelled correctly, like the fact of it couldn't quite settle. What kind of meeting runs until 11 o'clock at night? Okafor-Mensah was quiet for a moment. He was 51 years old. He had done 2 tours in Afghanistan, one in Mali, and 18 months attached to a NATO coordination unit in Brussels. He had sat across tables from generals and deputy ministers, and once, briefly, a head of state. He had learned, the hard way, the expensive way, that there were moments when patience was not weakness but precision. This was one of those moments. "The kind," he said carefully, "that involves operational security matters I'm not at liberty to discuss on the side of a road." Fawcett's expression shifted. Not softened, shifted. Something behind his eyes recalibrated. "Step out of the vehicle, please." "May I ask why?" "Step out of the vehicle." His hands were on the roof of the Volvos before he'd fully processed the instruction. Fawcett's partner, Arsenault, according to the tag, had materialized from nowhere and was now standing 3 feet to his left, close enough that Okafor-Mensah could hear the man's breathing. "Are you carrying any weapons or controlled substances?" "No." "Any sharp objects? Needles?" "No." "When's the last time you were stopped by police?" Okafor-Mensah turned his head slightly. "I don't see how that's relevant." "Answer the question, please," he answered. He'd been stopped twice in the last 4 years. Once in Kanata, once near the Rideau Centre. Neither stop had resulted in anything because there was nothing to result in. He was a man who drove the speed limit and signalled every turn. He told them this. Fawcett wasn't listening. He was on his radio, running the plates, running the license, running the name. The name that, if the system was working the way it was supposed to, would come back attached to a file that told a very particular story. It took 6 minutes. Okafor-Mensah stood beside his own car, in the cold October air, hands visible, watching his breath mist and dissolve while a 26-year-old constable waited for a computer to confirm what he, Okafor-Mensah, had already tried to say out loud. The radio crackled. Fawcett's face changed. He walked back toward the car slowly, the way people walk when they are rapidly recalculating something they had been very certain about. "Captain Okafor-Mensah," he said. The title sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, like a word he was pronouncing for the first time. There's been a..." "I know," Okafor-Mensah said quietly. "We received a call. A resident reported a vehicle matching this description." "I understand." Circling the block, and we were, "Constable." His voice was not raised. It was something more precise than raised. "I know the procedure. I've been watching it applied to people who look like me for 30 years. What I'd like to know is whether any of that procedure would have unfolded differently if my name had come back as something else." Arsenault, behind him, said nothing. Fawcett said nothing. The street said nothing. The radio crackled again, something distant, someone else's emergency, and the sound of it seemed to remind everyone that the world was still moving. Adisa Okafor-Mensah had arrived in Canada at the age of 7, in the back of a van from Pearson Airport. wearing a coat that was 2 sizes too large because his mother had bought it to last. His father, Emmanuel Okafor-Mensah, had come ahead of them by 8 months to find work, to find an apartment, to find something solid to stand on before the rest of the family crossed the water. Emmanuel had worked the overnight shift at a food processing plant in Mississauga for 2 years before he'd found anything better. He used to say, "You come to this country with 2 things, your name and your word. Make sure both of them are worth something." Adisa had taken that seriously. He'd joined the Canadian Armed Forces at 22, commissioned as an officer at 25, and spent the next 26 years building a record that, when it finally appeared on Constable Fawcett's screen, included 3 commendations, a meritorious service medal, a posting to NDHQ, and his current rank, captain, with a file notation indicating he held security clearance at a level that the 2 constables standing on Carling Avenue did not have access to view. The system hadn't flagged him as a threat. It had flagged him as someone who shouldn't have been standing outside at all. Not like this, not with his hands on his own roof, not with his documents surrendered to a stranger who hadn't yet said sorry. He had a 7 o'clock briefing in the morning. He had a daughter at Carlton who called him every Sunday. He had a wife at home who had been waiting up for him since 9:30, tracking his location on her phone the way she always did when he drove home late. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she had learned, over 23 years of marriage, to trust the city less than she trusted him. Her name was Blessing. She was the one who called. Okafor-Mensah's phone was still in the cup holder when it started ringing. He could see the screen from where he stood, Blessing, and he watched it ring through because he didn't have permission to reach for it yet, and he wasn't going to make any movement that could be misread in the dark. The phone rang out, then rang again, then went to voicemail. Fawcett noticed. "You can take that," he said. "I'll call her back," Okafor-Mensah said, "when this is finished." There was something in the way he said "when this is finished" that landed differently than a threat might have. It was a statement of fact, a kind of promise. The sort of thing a man says when he's certain about the outcome. And the only question is how long the other people in the conversation will take to arrive there. "Captain," Fawcett said, and there was something different in his voice now. Not quite an apology, but the outline of one, the shape where an apology might eventually live. "We're going to need to. My base commander's number is saved under Colonel Asara Boateng in my phone." Okafor-Mensah said the name precisely. "If you need to verify anything else, that's who you'd call. He's aware I was at the base tonight. So is the duty officer." Arsenault had moved away slightly. He was on his own radio now, speaking quietly, and whatever he was hearing was making him stand differently. His shoulders had changed position. Fawcett looked at his partner, then at Okafor-Mensah, then at the Volvo, then at the ground. "I'm going to ask you to bear with us for a few more minutes," he said. "I've been bearing with you for 14 minutes, Okafor-Mensah said. "I have 14 more minutes to give you. After that, I'm going to call my wife, and then I'm going to drive home, and then I'm going to decide what the next step looks like from there." It wasn't a threat, it was a clock. The call came through at 11:04 p.m. Arsenault received it first. Then he walked to Fawcett and said something Okafor-Mensah couldn't hear. And then Fawcett made a face that contained an entire education. Surprise, then comprehension, then the early uncomfortable stages of accountability. What the call contained, as Okafor-Mensah learned later through the formal complaint process and subsequent review, was the following: a duty officer at CFB Ottawa confirming that Captain Adisa Okafor-Mensah had been on base until 22:30, that he was authorized personnel with active clearance, and that the officer receiving the call should consider carefully what the next several minutes of his career were going to look like. The duty officer had not phrased it that harshly, but that was the meaning. Fawcett came back to where Okafor-Mensah was standing. "Captain," he said, "I owe you." "You don't owe me anything," Okafor-Mensah said. "You owe the process something. There's a difference." He took his documents back, checked his phone. 3 missed calls from Blessing, 1 voicemail, a text that read, "Adisa, where are you? I'm calling the base." He texted back, "On my way. I'm fine, I'll explain when I get home." Then he looked at Fawcett. The young constable was holding himself very still, in the way people hold themselves when they're trying to figure out how much trouble they're in. "How long have you been on the force?" Okafor-Mensah asked. 14 months, Fawcett said. "Then let me tell you something that nobody's going to write in your training manual." He wasn't angry when he said it. That was the part Fawcett would remember later, that the man he'd stopped wasn't angry. The badge you carry protects the people you serve. It doesn't replace your judgment. What you did tonight, responding to a call, following a protocol, running a check, none of that was wrong. How you carried yourself while you did it, that's the part worth thinking about. Whether you'd have spoken to a different man in a different car with a different name, exactly the same way, whether the tone would have been the same, whether step out of the vehicle would have come before or after an explanation. Fawcett didn't answer. Okafor-Mensah hadn't expected him to. "Go home safe," he said, and got in the car. The drive to Barhaven took 22 minutes. He kept the radio off. The city moved past the windows, the Tim Hortons, the QEW interchange, the lights of the neighborhoods that began to quiet the closer he got to home, and he sat with the particular fatigue that doesn't come from physical exertion, but from having to be precise when every instinct wanted to be raw. He was 51 years old. He had done this before. Not this exactly, not this specific street, this specific night, these specific two men, but this shape of event, this particular architecture of assumption and interruption. He had navigated versions of it in parking lots and pharmacies, and once, in the lobby of a government building where he was scheduled to present to a parliamentary committee, and a security guard had asked him if he was there for the maintenance work. He had learned to file the reports, to use the systems, to document what happened and place it somewhere it could accumulate, because individual incidents dissolved in time but patterns were persistent, and patterns, if documented carefully enough, eventually became impossible to ignore. He filed the complaint the next morning, before the 7 o'clock briefing, before the coffee, almost. What happened after the complaint is a matter of public record, or at least, the parts of it that didn't involve anything classified. Constable Fawcett and Constable Arsenault were placed under an administrative review by the Ottawa Police Service's Professional Standards Unit within 72 hours. The call that had initiated the stop, a resident reporting a suspicious vehicle circling the block, was reviewed. The vehicle had, in fact, only driven down the street once. It had not circled. What it had done was slow down at a stop sign, as vehicles typically do at stop signs, before proceeding legally. The resident who called was not named publicly, but it was noted, in the review summary, that no other vehicle matching a similar description and travelling the same route that evening had been reported. The review also noted that Constable Fawcett had failed to inform Captain Okafor-Mensah of the reason for the stop until after he had exited the vehicle, and that the language of the stop had been, in the committee's phrasing, procedurally adequate but contextually deficient, in a manner consistent with documented patterns of disproportionate police contact with black Canadians, which was a very long way of saying, "This happens too often, and we know it, and the record will now reflect that we said so." Fawcett received a formal reprimand and mandatory retraining. Arsenault, whose role in the stop was reviewed as secondary, received a lesser notation. The division commander issued a written acknowledgement to Captain Okafor-Mensah, through the office of the base liaison, that the stop had been handled without appropriate regard for procedural transparency or the dignity of the individual involved. It wasn't a fire, it wasn't a dismissal. Some people will read that and feel that it wasn't enough. Those people are not wrong. Okafor-Mensah never spoke publicly about that night. He was not the kind of man who sought cameras, but he did do something that nobody asked him to and that nobody reported. 2 months after the incident, he requested a meeting with the officer who had led the administrative review, and he brought with him a document, 12 pages, single-spaced, that he had spent 6 weeks writing. It was not a complaint. The complaint was already filed. This was something else. It was a proposal. Specifically, a proposal for a structured protocol for police interactions with active military personnel and veterans, with particular attention to the documented gap between the rates at which black Canadian service members reported blacks police their white counterparts. He cited data. He cited studies from Carlton and Dalhousie. He cited his own file, 31 years of service, 0 disciplinary notations, and the irony of needing a database query to convey what he had tried to say out loud and been talked over. The proposal was accepted. It was forwarded. It is, at the time of writing, in the later stages of committee review by the Ottawa Police Services Board. It may become policy, it may not. That is the nature of committees. But it was written, and it was submitted. and it exists now in a file somewhere with his name on it. His name, which his father told him was one of the two things worth protecting. The other thing, his father had said, was his word. He kept both. There's a version of this story that ends with a villain fired and a hero vindicated and everyone going home satisfied. That version is easier, it's cleaner. It fits better in 2 minutes. But the actual story, the one that happened to an actual man on an actual October night on Carling Avenue in Ottawa, is more complicated. And the complication is the point. Because the young constable on that street wasn't a monster. He was a person with a set of assumptions he'd never been asked to examine, responding to a phone call he had no reason to doubt, and defaulting to an authority that nobody had taught him to question. And the man beside the Volvo, with his hands on his own roof, and his phone ringing in the cup holder, and his wife tracking his location because the city had given her reasons to. That man was not remarkable for what happened to him. He was remarkable for what he did afterward. He didn't disappear into the night and swallow it. He didn't go home and decide it wasn't worth the fight. He sat down at his kitchen table at 1 a.m, while Blessing made tea, and he wrote down everything he remembered, in order, with times. And then he slept 4 hours, and he woke up and drove back to the base, and he did his job. And then he did the other job, the longer, slower, less visible job of pushing against the thing that had pushed against him, through the right channels, with the right documentation, in the right language, until the documentation became a record, and the record became a proposal, and the proposal became a possibility. That's not the satisfaction of a villain being fired. It's something quieter and, in its own way, harder to achieve. It's what happens when a person refuses to let what was done to them be the end of the story. If you've ever been stopped for nothing, looked at sideways, passed over, talked past, if you know someone who has, then you already understand why this matters. And if you don't understand yet, that's worth sitting with. Drop a comment below. Tell us what you think accountability looks like. Not in the easy version, but in the real one, because the real version is the one that changes things.